Now let's talk about exception handling. You need to understand that there are two things in any Java program which can happen. One is that some error can happen. Now errors can also be, during compile time there was an error and that's why the program could not get compiled, or during runtime some error occurred that actually gave us the wrong output. Now errors are such that you cannot do anything about them. You have to not have errors. You have to work against errors. You have to make sure that your programs are error free, because the program will definitely not compile if there are errors, or the program would definitely give a wrong output if there are errors. Another thing is exceptions. Exceptions are something which again can happen or can be detected during compile time, or which can happen during runtime. Now exceptions are such that they also halt the program, they terminate the program, but then if you know that some exception has occurred, you can actually handle it within the program and not cause the program to terminate. That is known as exception handling. We can handle exceptions if there are any in our program, and then based on what exception occurred, we can actually, do some workaround, do some, repair work within our code as well. That really makes so much of our code workable, because otherwise we would always land into some trouble with the user using our program, not giving a correct input or anything of that sort. But with exception handling, we will be able to work around all such scenarios of any wrong inputs, any wrong mishaps happening while our program is running. So now there is this throwable class in Java, and the throwable class is extended by two classes, exception and error, both of which denote exception and error. So now whatever is extending exception, that becomes an exception which we can catch. Okay, so when we say that, the program caused an exception or the program has an exception, we say that the program threw an exception to the user. And you have seen this, when we were working, we either had array out of bounds exceptions or we had null pointer exceptions. You saw it, right? That it actually terminated the program. It gave us a red message in the console that this exception has occurred, and on so and so line and due to so and so reason, etc. So those exceptions are extending the exception class. Now exception handling, as I said, it helps with, no automatic termination of program. That really helps us a lot. There are two types of exceptions. One is a checked exception and another is an unchecked exception. The checked exceptions are those which the program can check while it is compiling. So those are compile time. For example, they can be like class is not found, so it would say class not found exception, or we are trying to access some code which we cannot access from being from this particular class, so it would say illegal access exception, or we are trying to call a particular method but it doesn't exist, so that would be a no such method exception. And you remember, right, whenever I would call a method which I did not yet create, it would give a red mark. So those red marks, even the IDE is helping us that these are the red marks and these are the compile time problems in your code itself. So why not, just clear them up before you actually try to compile and then get those checked exceptions. So those are the things which we can work so that our program is compiled. But then once it is compiled, then whatever exceptions occur while the program is running, those are unchecked exceptions. For example, we could have any arithmetic problems like there is a divided by 0. Now, divide by 0 is an exception, so that would be an arithmetic exception. Or as I said, we are going out of bounds with an array index, so it would say array index out of bound exception. Or we would, have any argument which is not correct. For example, I took next int to take an integer from the user, but the user did not provide an integer. The user actually provided any other character or string or something. Then, it would give something like illegal argument exception, etc. So, if you have any null pointers in your program and you are trying to access a null value, then it would say null pointer exception. So all these are unchecked exceptions. Now for these unchecked exceptions, we can actually use some sort of mechanism by which we can understand that any unchecked exception has happened, and then we can actually try to work around that. So now even with an unchecked exception, so all these names which I gave you, null pointer exception, ArrayIndex out of bound exception, illegal argument exception, arithmetic exception, all these are built-in exceptions. These are exceptions which Java knows are there. But what if we have an application? So let's say in our e-commerce application, in our Java program, we are trying to work with the age, and age can always be between 18 to 130 years for our e-commerce website, or let's say 15 to 130 years. We are not allowing any user, let's say, with below 15 years of age. And we know that, in the demographic which we have, we do not have any person living more than 130 years. So we would always have that in between these two bounds. But what if in our program, we realize that our age is more than 130 or less than, 15? Then we would have our own exception, which may be age not appropriate or age out of range exception. We can create our own exception. Those are known as user-defined exceptions, and we can handle those exceptions as well in a program, similarly the way we would handle an inbuilt exception. Now, all those exceptions which we would be building by our own selves would also be extending this exception class. Now, let's try to actually work with some exceptions. In my Java short course, I'm creating a new file, a new class called exception handling. And in this, I want to add my main method. And now I want to actually calculate a result of an arithmetic problem. So I would say 15 divided by 0. Now I know that this is something which I am purposely doing, but it may be that you are doing any arithmetic exception and suddenly this figure comes up in your program. This causes an exception and you are not catching that exception and not handling that exception. So what would happen? So when I save this, so let's actually try to output this result. And when I save this, I try to run this. You will see that it says java.lang.arithmeticException and it says divided by 0, where on the line number 4. Okay, so here is where it says that, this particular exception has occurred. Now, we do not want this ugly exception to come to the user. Okay, so what we do is we can use something which is called as the try and catch. So what I'm doing is I'm trying some code. So within my try block, I would add all those lines of code in which I am doubtful that there may be some exception occurring just because, I'm doing some heavy arithmetic, or I'm trying to open a close a file which may not exist, or, any other indication which I would believe that, may cause an exception, or I'm working with age and, age might not be appropriate, etc. So all those lines I would put inside my try block, and then if it throws any exception to the user, I want to actually catch it. Okay, so that's why it's called catch. So I would catch that exception in my catch block. So I would write exception and I would just name the exception to be E or any other thing which I want. So here I just wrote E, and what I'm doing is I just want to work with this exception. So right now I'm not doing anything. I would just, print it. I would just print the exception E. So it won't make a lot of difference. Let me put this sys out over here. Now let's try to run this. Now it has a neater message. What we have is we are printing this particular exception from the catch block instead of from the try. Why? Because the exception got thrown, it actually is caught by this catch block, and now we are just printing it. Okay, so now we can actually work in many ways within that catch block. Now this exception is a generic exception, but what we have gotten is a specific exception of arithmetic. So we can actually write and catch only arithmetic expression over here. And we can actually catch any other type of exception in another catch block. So this would also work in exactly the same way. Now it is catching the arithmetic exception. If any other exception occurs, then this will not be able to catch it. It would go without catching. So another thing which I want to show is how do we create user-defined exceptions. So let's say we do have an integer age, and I'm putting this age to be 200, let's say. Now this age value is not correct for our program, and we want to see what age we are using. If there is any age which is, above 130, we want to throw another type of exception, which can be called, let's say, age out of range exception. So what I would do is, I would just try if age greater than 130, then I want to tell to the program that, this age is not correct. So I would throw a new exception. What is going to be that exception? I would say age out of bounds or age out of range exception. So I would throw this exception. Now this is not defined, and we actually have to use the new keyword over here. Now here what is happening is that I am purposely throwing this exception. So the program is not throwing, I am programming it to throw it, just so that we will be able to handle it within our code and we are not messing up with our entire remaining project program. As you can see over here, it says that it cannot be resolved to a type. So what it's saying is giving me an option to create this class. So I am going to create this particular class. So now it automatically extends exception for me over here, which does not happen with other classes, right? Whenever we try to create, it understands that this is a type of exception because we are using the throw keyword to throw this. So now over here, what I can do is probably I just want to show to the user what is the exception. Now here I would just create a simple constructor of this exception class, and I would just write super and just call the constructor of the exception class. That's it. Or I could create another constructor which would actually take the message and then call the super class constructor for the same message. This is just to display the message to the user. That's it. So this is a simple code which we can write in a user defined exception, but the main thing is that I just threw this exception. So now we can actually have nested tries. So we can have a try within a try. I have this main try in which I'm checking first the age, and then I am trying for this particular result, which would be age divided by 0, let's say, and then I'm actually trying to catch any issue with this division operation as well. So if I close this, now any try should not be closed or is not complete without a catch or a finally statement. So I should definitely catch the exception, and over here, what exception can I catch? I can catch this age out of range exception, right? So I would take this as A, and I would just, again, I would just want to write to the user that, the age you entered is not correct. So now I'm trying to format this Control Shift F. As you can see over here, the indentation. First we have a try. I'm writing some code over here. This code might throw an exception based on the value of age. My value of age can be anything. I just put 200 over here just to check. Then I have my code which is surrounded by another try within this try, and this is being caught over here. This code can throw arithmetic exception. That's why I am catching arithmetic exception over here. Then my main try, what can it possibly throw? It can throw age index out of range exception. So that's why, I'm catching it and showing the message to the user. Let's try to run this and see what happens. So now this says that, the age you entered is not correct. So immediately as the age out of bound range exception is thrown, it actually terminated the entire try. It did not even go ahead. Let me try to change the age now to 20. And when I try to run this, now it says that, there is an arithmetic exception. So can you understand how we can use a nested try and multiple catch to be able to work with the different types of scenarios in which, we may want to test our code? Another thing which I can think is, instead of doing this, we can actually remove this try, and instead of, trying it multiple times, we can only have, multiple catch statements for a single try. So it may be that I'm trying to find what is the age. So I just formatted it. I'm trying to find what is the age. If the age is inappropriate, I threw an exception. But otherwise, if the age is appropriate, I'm trying to do something. And I know that, there could be this exception which I want to catch. Also, there could be an arithmetic exception happening, which I want to catch. So both of these are possible, and this is another way in which we can use multiple catch statements for a single try as well. So let's try to run this. We do have this arithmetic exception over here just because our age is correct. But let's change the age now and run this. Now we have that, the age age out of range exception is also there. So you understood how we could use try, how we could have nested try statements, how we could have multiple catch statements for a single try, how we could throw our own exception, how we could create our own exception by extending the exception class and just creating, the relevant constructors. Now lastly, there is a type of statement which is known as finally. This is another keyword which we have along with try and catch. So finally is a block of code which would execute every time the try block succeeds or fails. So in both the cases, this finally statement will definitely get executed. This would have, anything like, closing any open files or, undoing anything which is open. So anything, which you want to close, any session you want to close, any resources which are open you want to close, whether the try passes or fails, you would do that over here. So here I will just, simple do a sysout completed execution. Now let's try to run this. So it says completed execution even though our try fails and we do have a catch executing. Or let's try that, none of the tries fail. We do not have a divide by 0 exception as well. Let's try to run this. So now it gives us the result, but it also completes the execution. So finally statement is definitely executed, in any case. So let's try to put these exception conditions back. One very important thing which you need to know is that whenever you are using these multiple catch statements, you should always make sure that you are going from specific to a generic exception. For example, if you actually try to catch an exception over here, which is of the generic class exception, from which we are actually, extending these other exceptions, age out of range exception or arithmetic exception. If I actually, try to print over here or do anything over here, that, exception generic caught. Now you can see it itself says that, unreachable catch block for age out of range exception, it is already handled by the catch block for exception. So it is giving us two quick fixes that you either remove this catch clause or you replace this catch clause with throws. So we will see what is the new and the last keyword, throws. What does it mean? But the point is that if we try to actually execute this, you will see that it says that, these are already handled by the catch block for exception and these are unreachable. So you should not go from generic to specific. You should always go from specific to generic so that it is able to catch the relevant exception for you. Now the last thing which is left is the throws keyword. Now let's say, for example, this was not in main. We do have another method. Let's say we have a private check age. And in this actually we are, checking this particular age. We do have an age. So I'm taking this entire try catch over here. So I could actually call just the check age. And passing this age of 200 over here. This would take an integer age and check this whether age is 130 or not. This should be static and void. And this part, let's just comment this. Now as you can see, we do have an age and it will check an age and there is a try and catch over here. This is one way in which you can do. But generally, if we do not have a try catch over here, let's say, Now, there is a red mark over here. And what does it say? It says unhandled exception type age out of range exception. We have to add a throws declaration. And if we add a throws declaration, what this would mean is that this particular method is capable of throwing a particular exception in any condition. It may be that we are ourselves throwing that exception, or it may be that our code is doing something, let's say using or opening or closing files, or doing some IO transactions, or doing something in our program which may cause some or the other exception. So your IDE will be happy to tell you that your code can actually create some exception. So either you surround it with try and catch, or you throw it from your method. So instead of actually adding the try and catch, we could also use throws so and so exception, and then finally work on this particular exception in the calling method. So what is the calling method of check age? For check age, we have the calling method which is main. Now here again it says that there is this unhandled exception. Either add a throws declaration or surround it with try catch. So if we add a throws declaration, the main would also throw age out of range exception. Now obviously there is no other method which is going to call main. Main is already called, right? So the Java runner will actually then handle the exception. Instead of actually throwing this exception from the calling method, we could also surround it with try and catch. So now what's happening is that it is actually catching the age out of range exception itself, and then printing the stack trace for us. So now instead of print stack trace, I'll just do the same sys out that age is incorrect. And then I can uncomment this entire part, just because now I can also catch any other arithmetic exception or any other thing which is happening. Now if we try to run this says age is incorrect, completed execution. What if the age was correct? I save this, and when I run this, now it gives an exception. Where is this exception being caught? This exception is being caught over here. And that is because this check age is actually also throwing the arithmetic exception back to the calling method, and now calling method is actually working to catch an arithmetic exception over here. If we did not have this part, then this exception wouldn't have been handled. So if we actually save this and ran this, now you would see that the exception was not handled properly by the program. So we need that part of the code as well. So this is how you would actually use the throws keyword if you don't want to handle the exception within this method, and make sure that the calling method actually now works with handling this particular exception. If the calling method also does not handle the exception, then lastly the Java runner itself, the JVM itself is going to work and handle that particular exception. How is it going to do? It is just simply going to print it in the stack trace just like this. So that's pretty much about exception handling. We saw the nested try statements, we saw multiple catch clauses, we saw how we could have chained exceptions, we saw how we could define our own exceptions. We also saw about the finally keyword, whether an exception occurs or not, whether it was handled or not. The finally clause will definitely execute in any case. We also saw about throw and throws. And we also saw that, if there are multiple functions calling each other, so one method calls another method, who calls another method, etc., the exception is thrown, let's say, by the innermost method, and that is actually, if it is not handled by the method, it is actually propagated to the calling method and then to the calling method, and finally, it is handled by the JVM if no other method is handling that. So I hope by this you are very clear with exception handling, and you will have no confusion by looking at anybody's code or doing your own coding for exceptions and for handling them. So that's it. I'll see you in the next video.